So I'm going to start today with the autobiography in 5 short chapters. Chapter 1. I walk down the street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I'm lost. I'm helpless. It isn't my fault. And it takes forever to get out. Chapter 2. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. Glad I didn't fall, really. I can't believe I'm in the same place. It isn't my fault. Again, it takes a really long time to get out. Chapter 3. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see that it's there. I fall in. It's a habit. But now my eyes are open. I know where I am, and it is my fault. I get out immediately. Chapter 4. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Chapter 5. I walk down a different street. I walk down a different street. This is actually the short biography in 5 chapters is perfect for today's talk, which is focusing on making the connection and about the spiritual power known as understanding. We've been studying a couple Sundays of each month, one of the 12 powers. See, co-founder Charles Fillmore looked at the Bible from a metaphysical point of view and said, everybody has a trait or there's some significance that we can relate to. So the 12 disciples, he saw, each had a spiritual ability that we all have, but we don't know it. And not only do we not know it, we don't know how to engage in it. See, we're using our powers or abilities all the time. January, what was the January one? Imagination. February was the power of love. Oh, now we're going to get tricky here. In April, the power was will. And last month, no, that was March, sorry. Do I need to know the months? No, I just know the powers. So it was will in March, and then in April, it starts with an F, faith. And so now we're going to look at understanding. And one of the books that I highly, highly recommend is Divine Audacity by Linda Martella-Whitsett. It talks about the 12 powers, and I really like her interpretation. And she does say at the beginning, all of our spiritual powers or abilities are inherent, means we're born with them, arising from the source. We come fully loaded with every ability. Our abilities are native to us, not acquired, never subject to depletion, and they're always existent. However, although our spiritual abilities are natural to us, they exist in potential until they are recognized, activated, and developed. That is why I'm dedicated to sharing one of the powers on a couple Sundays each month. So we're going to be looking at the spiritual power of understanding. So the other book that I highly recommend that also has, this is called Power Up Your Life, Accessing Your 12 Powers to Achieve Health, Happiness, Abundance, and Inner Peace. Power Up Your Life. The definition, because it's always good to start with, what is understanding? The definition, according to Power Up Your Life, is that it is the power, understanding is the power, to comprehend and interpret knowledge. And the second one is make cognitive connections. Cognitive connections. Now, the word that catches my attention out of that definition is the word connections. Because isn't life all about connections? I mean, it's about connections. And when you are connected, life is happening. And when you're disconnected, it's not happening in the best way possible. Connecting to source, connecting to ourselves, connecting to another. Connection is life, and to be connected. So, again, back into Linda Martella Whitsett's book, she takes each one of the abilities or powers and she breaks it down into 3 elements. The 3 elements of understanding are number 1, comprehension, number 2, realization, and number 3, insight. And I'm going to briefly cover these today. She says about, and I just said the word connection, so listening for that word. Comprehension comes from, back up. Next page. Comprehension is our ability to discover connections between thought and feeling, between the body's messages and our habits of thought, between accumulated beliefs and unalterated truth. Big word for this kid. Through comprehension, we make sense of seemingly incompatible or unrelated ideas. And we learn about aspects of who we are by listening to our life. Comprehension comes from listening to your life. A life review, which is also a hallmark of recovery programs and other personal development systems, shines a spotlight on our long-held beliefs, patterns of thought, and habits of behavior. Activating our power of understanding, we see the past in a context of wholeness. We engage with our deepest longings and sense of purpose. Now, Charles Fillmore said that there's 2 ways that you can get understanding. One is by following the guidance of spirit that dwells within. And the other is to go blindly ahead and learn by hard experience. Have you all done that too? Right? Yeah, we know which one we'd prefer. So taking the time to reflect and listen, we can use our learning and studying and meditating to help have a greater comprehension. Did you know that there's 2 types of understanding, though? There is the intellectual understanding, where we're connecting the dots of things that as we're learning. In Power Up Your Life, intellectual understanding is gained mostly through experience and the School of Hard Knocks. I think we just heard a referral to that. By combining our reasoning with our intellectual understanding, we usually come to valid and practical conclusions. However, spiritual understanding is where we really want to go, and that's where I want to focus. Spiritual understanding is gained by investing time in the silence. It results from the quickening of our spiritual nature, our divine nature. And this type of knowledge sometimes includes and always transcends intellectual understanding. This knowing comes swiftly and arises outside of our reasoning process. It comes as that internal knowing, perhaps that still small voice that may seem like a reflection or an echo of something that we have heard or forgotten. So how is it that we are to gain spiritual understanding from what I just read? What is the word? Silence. Taking time to invest in the silence. How many of you invest in the silence? Good. You must be in a spiritual community somewhere, doing your spiritual practice. I want you to think about, you know that the letters in the word silence and listen are the same letters? Isn't that interesting? Yes. I mean, seriously, you'll probably go home and go, write the word listen, because I did this, and then I wrote the word silence, and then I'm like, oh, that connects. Oh, they're all the same letters. So here's the truth. It's basically, if you're going into the silence, it is to listen. It is to listen to that still small voice. Okay, this thing is doing things on its own. Now, Charles Fillmore, who is the co-founder of Unity, he spent a lot of time in the silence. In fact, he called it going to headquarters. He would sit in his rocking chair and he'd have his eyes closed, and he called it going to headquarters. He was going to that which I call my boss, my inner boss. And one of the greatest minds ever, Albert Einstein, used to sit in his chair, and he would hold a metal spoon and he would go inside into that silence with questions or thoughts. And he would go into the silence and listen. And what would happen is, if he, underneath that metal spoon was a metal bucket, so if he fell asleep, boom, he'd drop the spoon into the metal bucket and wake up. You might try that when you're doing the silence. Is it warm in here? Oh, well, you're doing this, so I'm like, can you bring the fan up here? So, going into the silence with a question, just to be with what comes. And then you can just watch it come through. And when you're in that silence, you might find yourself moving into the second aspect of understanding, which is called realization. Realization. So realization, according to Linda, she says it's either a flash of understanding, or it might be that gradual dawning of awareness. It comes as a result of growing comprehension, and yet comprehension is usually more effortful, where realization tends to be effortless. It just came to me. Suddenly I knew, I got it. It was revealed. Anyone ever have that experience? I think we all have. We've all had that. That's when we're in our higher level of consciousness, the higher mind, the God self. We're in the penthouse, and we're seeing, you know the word realize? You can change the spelling to R-E-A-L, real, E-Y-E-S, to see with real eyes, to see from a higher perspective, instead of the basement of appearances and our physical senses. I want to move up and have a realization from my real eyes of something that is a higher perspective. Sometimes when I'm troubled, I'll go, how does Spirit see this situation? How does Spirit see this person? How does Spirit see? Because I have those little blinders on. But what is my higher self? What is its sight? And now that takes us actually into the third component, which is insight. Okay, so you've got comprehension, where you're connecting. You've got the realization, where you're rising up into a higher perspective. And then you have insight. What Linda Martelowitz says about insight, it is our capacity to employ realization in particular circumstances, applied understanding. Because you can have understanding, but is it applicable? Can you apply it? The more you comprehend and realize spiritual truths, the more likely your insights will be accurate and useful. Insight is not cold calculation, but it is spiritual intelligence arising in both the head and the heart. Left and right side of the brain could be also. Needleman, in the book What is God, says the mind. The intellect is not simply the logical, analytical, or even intuitive organ located in the head. The real mind, the real instrument of understanding, is a blending of at least two fundamental sources of perception, the intellect and the heart. The intellect and genuine feeling. And the genuine feeling is not the same as an emotional reaction. So I want to share with you an example of insights that my father has, I have grown in my insights of my dad. He passed in 2019. And my dad never graduated, or maybe he did graduate from high school, but that was the extent of his learning. But he had the spirit of an entrepreneur. And back in the 1970s, he built a lot of, he purchased some land, and he had a building built. And his logic was people are always going to need food. And my grandfather owned a small grocery store. So my dad had, in the 70s, a beautiful building. It was called Luoma's Value King. It had the first deli, the first bakery, the first curbside service. My dad was an entrepreneur, and he built this wonderful Luoma's Value King, and he was a hard worker, and he also liked to play. And he had the disease of alcoholism, high-functioning person, but it was, I came to understand as an adult child of an alcoholic, which I didn't even understand until I started going to the bookstore, and I was like, oh, wow. So I started to look at my dad, and I had some anger because he wasn't emotionally available for me. I worked for my dad. In fact, I was very close to him in the business world. I worked as a cashier at 14. I was a deli manager at 18. My dad at some point sold his businesses and became an auctioneer. And I worked for him at different times in the auctioneer business. So what I realized about my dad was a few things in the understanding. I took a class called Cultural Communication, and I got to study cultures, my background cultures, and my dad was of Finnish descent. And when I read about the culture of the Finnish men and women, I was like, oh, my dad's not fill in the blank. He's not a jerk. He's not whatever. He's a good Finn, right? Good Finns, they work hard and they drink. And I was like, so there was an insight, right, into my dad's behavior on some level. It's like, oh, it changed my perception of him. So next time I saw him once, and we were at his mother's house, and she was in assisted living, independent, and he got ticked off. My dad could be a rageaholic. What he would do is he'd get very ticked off, and he would leave. That was how he did. And I was just like, of course, I'm using a word about him again that I'm not going to say from this, from here, the platform. But I'm like, what a jerk. He stomps off because my grandmother said something. And then the light bulb went off. And of all things, I didn't understand. But my dad, his rage was his love. That was like, a what? Because my dad it's not okay to show vulnerable feelings. He felt helpless is what he felt, because he couldn't do whatever needed to be done for his mother. So he gets rageful and he stomps out. Rage was how he showed love. What? So talk about a shift in consciousness to realize that, yes, it's not okay to feel sad. It's not okay to be afraid or helpless. The man doesn't show those feelings. So he would rage, because underneath rage or anger, there's always another emotion, and it is a more vulnerable emotion of sad or fear or helpless. And I know that about myself. So when I'm ticked off, I can ask myself that same thing. Last but not least, I did have a counselor. Love him. It was at Cal State Fullerton. And I was taking classes, and with him, I realized that I needed to have counseling. So I finished the class and started counseling with him. And he became, for me, my daddy steward. He was the dad that I never had. And so I would bring my journals in and share my anger and my sadness towards my dad. I wrote my dad a letter that I thought was loving and just confronting and just saying, I understand you have the disease of alcoholism. And I read it to Stuart, and he was like, okay, you could send that. Well, then my dad didn't respond, and then I was hurt by that, and I had to feel my feelings again. Then one day, this was done with the anger, done with the sadness, and realized that my dad never had a daddy Stewart. He never had what I was having. My dad never had that type of a nurturing person, man in his life. And so from that, he could only give me what he knew from his culture and his background. I had then only compassion. It broke my heart open. It's like, my dad never had a daddy Stewart. I can't be angry at that. I can only have compassion. In the book, under this section called Insight, she speaks of this. She said, compassion is the fruit of understanding. Insight led me to kindly understand my dad and release any blame or judgmentalness. Insight is my sense of understanding deeply that others and myself are cut from the same cloth, that we are one. Insight is my awareness in how to respond rather than to react, how to behold the inherent good in others as well as in myself, and then how to behave in the light of that truth. Insight is not psychologically analyzing another person. It is the present awareness of my divinity and others' divinity. So would you like to know how you, personally, the 4 steps and the way that you can grow your own spiritual understanding? Say, yes. That's what I needed to hear. Otherwise, we're done. No. So it's called DARE. Dare to spiritually understand. You know I like acronyms. It helps me remember, might help you remember. DARE, D-A-R-E. In order to have spiritual understanding, first of all, D, you have to have a desire to spiritually understand. If you have no desire to understand, forget about it. Don't do the rest of the DARE. You have to have a desire to have an understanding. A, ask questions. Be curious. You want to ask questions. Be curious and be open to learning. And be willing to be uncomfortable. You know, because we know this, but if I don't know it, what is it that I don't know that I don't know? So ask questions. So desire, ask questions are rest and reflect. And what that means is what we just spoke about, to listen. When I'm resting and reflecting, I'm listening to the heart. I'm listening to the heart of spirit. So I'm resting and reflecting, and I'm listening from my higher mind. And E in DARE is to engage. Engage my insights. Engage. Is there something I can do with this new understanding? Is there an action I can take? So, DARE. Have a desire, ask questions, reflect, and listen. And E, engage in your insights. So that is to DARE, and I'm going to go back to our original autobiography in 5 short chapters and show you the relation. First of all, chapter 1, you walk down the street, right? And there's a hole in the sidewalk. You fall in, you're helpless, you're lost, it's not your fault, and it takes you forever to find a way out. That's when you have absolutely no understanding whatsoever, right? I don't understand any of this. Chapter 2, I walk down the same street and there's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it and I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in the same place and it's still not my fault and it's still taking me a long time to get out. I'm starting to awaken to something, but I'm not quite fully awake. No, chapter 3, I walk down the same street, and that deep hole in the sidewalk, it's still there. I see it's there, and I fall in again, and it's a habit. But now it's my fault because I'm aware of it. My eyes are open. I know it's my fault, and I'm getting out immediately. That's when you're now conscious. You're aware. So there is an awakening going on in chapter 3. Chapter 4, I walk down that same street, and there's a hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. That's when you have intellectual understanding. Chapter 5, I walk down a different street. That is when you have spiritual understanding, right? So I'm going to dare you. Let us dare to be spiritually understanding. Let us dare to walk down a different street, and let us dare to apply our spiritual understanding so that we can move up to a higher ground of living, of seeing, and being. Let's move up to that higher ground of living with our spiritual understanding. I dare you, and so it is.